What happens when one of the most iconic movie stars in the history of cinema, a man who has played two of the most beloved characters ever created, who is famous for being as gruff and non-nonsense in real life as the heroes he portrays on screen, sits down for a late-night interview only to be pushed past his famously short patience by a host who mistakes mockery for wit. What you're about to witness is one of the most uncomfortable confrontations ever captured on late-night television. The moment when Harrison Ford, the man who made Han Solo and Indiana Jones into cultural legends, reminded the world that the steely intensity he brings to his roles isn't just acting. The studio went dead silent. The laughter stopped completely, and Jimmy Kimmel discovered that some Hollywood legends don't find mockery amusing, especially when it comes at the expense of their life's work. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments because, trust me, you're going to want to talk about this one. In the green room, his publicist tried to review talking points, but Harrison waved her off with characteristic impatience. He had been doing this for 50 years. He didn't need coaching on how to talk to a television host. What he needed was for the interview to be over as quickly as possible, so he could get back to his ranch in Wyoming, far from the Hollywood machine he had always held at arm's length. What nobody anticipated was that Jimmy had arrived at the studio that evening determined to break through Ford's famous reserve. Using whatever tactics necessary to get a reaction, the house band played Harrison onto the stage, and the audience applause was thunderous, the kind of reception reserved for true legends of the industry. Harrison walked out with his characteristic half-smile, the one that somehow conveyed appreciation and impatience simultaneously. He shook Jimmy's hand firmly, settled into the guest chair, and immediately looked like he was counting the minutes until he could leave. "Harrison Ford, everybody," Jimmy announced, his trademark grin firmly in place. "It's always an event when you come on the show. You don't do a lot of these talk show appearances." "No, I don't," Harrison replied, his voice carrying that famous growly quality. "I'm here because they told me I had to be. Contractual obligations." The audience laughed, appreciating the brutal honesty. This was classic Harrison Ford, and everyone expected Jimmy to play along with the established dynamic that had characterized Ford interviews for decades. Instead, Jimmy leaned forward with something that looked almost like challenge in his eyes. "You know, Harrison, you've been doing interviews for 50 years now, and you've become almost as famous for hating interviews as you are for your movies. But I have to ask, isn't that kind of an act at this point? I mean, you keep showing up. You keep doing the publicity. If you really hated it that much, wouldn't you just stop doing them entirely?" The question was more pointed than Harrison had expected. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "It's part of the job. I don't have to enjoy every part of the job to do it professionally." "But that's what I'm getting at," Jimmy pressed, sensing an opportunity. The grumpy Harrison Ford thing, the monosyllabic answers, the visible discomfort. It's become your brand at this point. Don't you think people would be disappointed if you actually seemed to be having a good time for once? There was something almost mocking in Jimmy's tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't think about branding Jimmy. I think about doing my work and then going home to my family. If that comes across as grumpy to you, that's your interpretation, not my intention." Jimmy laughed, but there was an edge to it that didn't go unnoticed. "Come on, Harrison. You have to admit there's something a little performative about the whole thing. The reluctant movie star who just wants to be left alone, but keeps making blockbuster movies and doing press tours. At some point, you've got to own the fact that you like the attention, right?" The accusation seemed to land somewhere uncomfortable. Harrison sat very still for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something quieter, but noticeably more dangerous. "I don't like attention, Jimmy. I never have. What I like is the work, the actual craft of making films. Everything else that comes with it, the interviews, the premieres, the constant invasion of privacy, that's the price I pay for getting to do what I love. It's not a performance. It's just who I am." Jimmy seemed to sense he had found a weak point and pushed harder. "But isn't there something kind of ungrateful about that attitude? I mean, millions of people love your movies. They've made you incredibly wealthy and famous beyond imagination, and you act like doing publicity for those movies is some kind of punishment. Don't the fans deserve better than that?" The word ungrateful hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Harrison's expression hardened noticeably. "Ungrateful? You want to talk about ungrateful? I've spent 50 years showing up on time, doing my own stunts, giving everything I have to every single role. I've broken bones, torn ligaments, nearly died in a plane crash, all in service of entertaining those fans you're talking about. And you think sitting here being uncomfortable in an interview makes me ungrateful? The mention of the plane crash seemed to give Jimmy an opening he was looking for. Speaking of the plane crashes, and there have been a few over the years, don't you think at some point you should maybe stop flying? I mean, you're 82 years old, Harrison. How many close calls do you need before you admit that maybe it's time to hang up the pilot's license? The question was clearly designed to provoke, touching on something deeply personal. Harrison's love of flying was well known, as were the accidents that had made headlines over the years. My flying is none of your business, Jimmy. It's also none of your audience's business. What I do in my private life, the risks I choose to take, that's between me and my family. It's not fodder for your monologue or your comedy bits. But you're a public figure, Jimmy countered with a slight smirk. When you crash a plane on a golf course in Santa Monica, that becomes public. When you have a near miss with an airliner at Orange County Airport, that becomes news. You don't get to compartmentalize your life that neatly when you're Harrison Ford. Something shifted in Harrison's demeanor. The careful neutrality gave way to something that looked like genuine anger, controlled but unmistakable. Actually, I do get to compartmentalize my life. That's called boundaries, Jimmy. Something that people in your profession seem to have trouble understanding. Just because I made some movies that people like doesn't mean I owe anyone access to every aspect of my existence. Jimmy tried to steer the conversation in another direction, but his version of retreat was actually another attack. Okay, let's talk about the movies then. You've gone back to the well pretty often lately. Indiana Jones again. Han Solo again. Don't you think there's something a little sad about an 82-year-old man still playing characters he created when he was 40? At what point does nostalgia become desperation? The question was stunning in its cruelty. Several audience members gasped audibly. Even the band members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Harrison stared at Jimmy for a long moment, and those who had watched his films recognized the look. It was the same expression Han Solo wore before shooting first in that Mos Eisley cantina. Sad? You think it's sad that audiences still want to see these characters? That studios are willing to invest hundreds of millions of dollars because they believe people will show up? That's not sad, Jimmy. That's called having a legacy. Something you build over decades by being consistently good at what you do. But is it really a legacy if you keep going back to it over and over? Jimmy pushed. At some point, doesn't it become more about the money than the art? I mean, what was the last original thing you did that anyone actually remembers? Harrison's laugh was short and humorless. The last original thing I did? I've done dozens of films outside of those franchises. Witness. The Fugitive. Air Force One. What Lies Beneath. The Mosquito Coast. Presumed Innocent. I've worked with every major director of my generation. I've played presidents and cops and lawyers and ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. But that's not what you want to talk about, is it? You just want to reduce 50 years of work to 2 characters because that's an easier story to tell. He leaned forward, his presence suddenly dominating the space between them. Let me tell you something about those characters, Jimmy. When I first played Han Solo, I was a carpenter. I was making cabinets for George Lucas's office, and I got cast almost by accident. I had no idea that character would change my entire life. And when I put on that vest again 40 years later, it wasn't about money. It was about honoring something that meant something to millions of people around the world, including me. Jimmy tried to interject. But surely you can see how it looks from the outside. I don't care how it looks from the outside, Harrison cut him off. I've never cared about how things look. I care about how they are. And what they are is this. I've spent my entire adult life trying to create characters that feel real, that audiences can believe in, that means something beyond just entertainment. If that's reduced to nostalgia in your eyes, that says more about you than it does about me. The observation landed with uncomfortable precision. Jimmy's smile had become strained. I'm just asking the questions that I think viewers might be curious about. No, you're not. Harrison's voice was flat and cold. You're trying to provoke a reaction. You're trying to get the grumpy old man to lose his temper, so you can have a viral clip for tomorrow. I've been doing this long enough to recognize the game, Jimmy, and I'm not interested in playing it. He started to stand, but Jimmy reached out as if to stop him. Harrison, come on. Sit down. Let's talk about the new project. We should have been talking about the new project from the beginning. Harrison remained standing, his full height commanding attention despite his age. Instead, you've spent 15 minutes questioning my character, my choices, my right to privacy, and my entire career. That's not an interview. That's an attack. Jimmy's expression shifted to something that might have been defensiveness. I'm a comedian, Harrison. I push buttons. That's what I do. You can't take everything so seriously. I can take it however I want to take it. Harrison's voice was steady, but carried an edge that made the entire studio seem to hold its breath. And what I'm taking from this conversation is that you have no respect for me, my work, or the basic courtesy that should exist between a host and a guest. He straightened his jacket with deliberate calm. I've been in this business for 50 years. I started with nothing. I was a carpenter who got lucky, and I worked every single day to turn that luck into something real and lasting. I've never asked for special treatment. I've never demanded to be worshipped. All I've ever asked is to be treated with basic professional respect. He looked directly at Jimmy, his gaze unflinching. You invited me here, supposedly, to talk about a project I'm proud of. Instead, you've mocked my discomfort with publicity, questioned my gratitude to fans, brought up personal matters that are none of your business, and suggested that my career is nothing but a nostalgia act. That's not comedy, Jimmy. That's contempt. And I don't sit still for contempt from anyone. Jimmy seemed to realize he had miscalculated badly. Harrison, I apologize if anything I said came across as disrespectful. That wasn't my intention. Wasn't it? Harrison's eyebrow raised skeptically. Because from where I was sitting, it seemed very intentional. It seemed like you had decided before I even sat down that you were going to needle me until I gave you the reaction you wanted. Well, here's your reaction. I'm leaving. He turned to address the camera directly. To anyone watching who came to hear about the new film, I'm sorry you didn't get that tonight. The film is something I'm very proud of, made with people I respect, telling a story I think is worth telling. I hope you'll see it and judge it on its merits, not on whatever this interview has become. He looked back at Jimmy one final time. You know what the difference is between you and me, Jimmy? I've spent my life building things, characters, films, a body of work that will exist long after I'm gone. You've spent your career making fun of people who actually create things. That's fine. That's your job. But don't mistake the fact that you have a platform for the idea that you have the right to disrespect people who've earned their place in this industry. He nodded once, a gesture of finality. I've been Han Solo and Indiana Jones. I've been the President of the United States and a wrongly accused man running for his life. I've given audiences 50 years of my life, my sweat, my blood, my broken bones. And I did it because I love the work, not because I love sitting in chairs being questioned by people who don't understand what that work costs. He started to walk toward the exit, then stopped and turned back. You asked earlier if I enjoy any of this, the publicity, the interviews, the constant exposure. The answer is no. I never have. But I do it anyway because it's part of the deal I made when I chose this career. What I won't do is sit still while someone mocks me for being honest about that. I'd rather be authentically uncomfortable than pretend to be something I'm not for your entertainment. The studio was absolutely silent. Jimmy sat frozen behind his desk, the usual quick wit completely absent. I've lived 82 years, Harrison continued, his voice quieter now, but somehow more powerful. I've survived plane crashes and onset injuries, and the kind of scrutiny that would break most people. I've raised children and buried friends and watched the world change in ways I never could have imagined. And through all of it, I've tried to stay true to who I am. Uncomfortable in the spotlight. Happiest when I'm working or flying or just being left alone. He met Jimmy's eyes one last time. That's not a brand, Jimmy. That's not a performance. That's just a man who knows who he is and isn't interested in pretending otherwise. I hope someday you figure out who you really are. Because from what I've seen tonight, you're spending a lot of energy being clever when you could be spending it being genuine. And with that, Harrison Ford walked off the stage of Jimmy Kimmel Live, leaving behind a stunned silence that seemed to swallow the entire studio. The audience wasn't sure whether to applaud or simply sit in shock at what they had witnessed. The band leader started to play something, then thought better of it and let the silence continue. Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk looking like a man who had just watched a masterclass in dignity and realized he had been on the wrong side of it. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked all of its usual energy and confidence. We'll be right back after these messages. But everyone in that studio knew that what had just happened couldn't be fixed with a commercial break. A legend had been disrespected, and that legend had responded not with shouting or drama, but with the same quiet, devastating authenticity that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. The aftermath of that interview would dominate entertainment news for weeks. Clips of Harrison's measured but powerful defense of his privacy and his work would be shared millions of times across every social media platform. Think pieces would be written about celebrity interviews, about the line between humor and disrespect, about what entertainers owe the public and what they have the right to keep for themselves. But perhaps the most significant outcome was what the confrontation revealed about authenticity in an age of constant performance. Harrison Ford had spent 50 years being exactly who he was, uncomfortable with fame, but committed to his craft, private, but not pretentious, gruff, but genuine. And when challenged on that authenticity by someone who mistook it for an act, he had simply demonstrated that some people really are who they appear to be, and that genuine character is worth more than all the clever quips in the world. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Jimmy Kimmel out of line, or was he just doing his job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.